This is the I Read Comic Books podcast, and I am your host for this week's episode, Paul Jasley, filling in for Mike Rapin. But of course, filling in for Mike is not a task that one person alone can do. I'm joined by two of the coolest comic book fans that I know of, with Paloma Deer.
Hello, hello, hello.
And Tia Vasiliou.
Hi.
How are you both? That's the question we always ask. How are you doing? How have comic books been? But we have a special episode today. We're not going to be talking about the comics we read. We decided to focus on a particular group of comics, a particular creator that we enjoy. We've talked about on the show before. And I don't know, Tia, I kind of want to throw it to you to explain today's topic and theme, since you were the one who suggested we read a bunch of comics by Simon Hanselmann today.
Right. Okay. So my stream of consciousness, like getting us from point A to point B, goes like this. A friend sent me a Instagram post, I think, from Simon Hanselmann, where he was talking about how like Below Ambition, which came out in 2022, didn't do as well as the other Megg and Mogg books, but he doesn't care. I was like, yeah, man, like same. Oh, wait, I actually forgot to buy that one. Fuck, like I am the problem. So I bought it. And then I was like, oh, this comes with like a cool little like flexi disc. And it's about Meg's band, and her band is called Horse Mania. And Horse Mania is actually the reason I'm not really on the podcast anymore. So I just felt like the universe was sort of aligning to be like, this is a good topic.
Yeah. So for those who maybe aren't familiar, Simon Hanselmann is a cartoonist who's done a lot of books over the years, a lot of self-published mini comics, and then some collected books published by Fantagraphics, all under the sort of umbrella of these characters, Megg and Mogg. And I guess the short version is like Megg is a witch and Mogg is her cat, who's also her ex. That's implied in the comics, right? And They have a pantheon of friends that they, friends would be one way to describe these people that they hang out with. I'm not sure
group.
Social group. Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting characters. You have Owl, who's an owl, very straight-laced, kind of by the books for the most part. Werewolf Jones, who's a whole topic unto himself, as well as his kids, his two sons. And these books, they are of a vibe. And I kind of, at this point, I feel like I should throw it to Paloma, because I think, Paloma, this is your first kind of experience with Megg and Mogg. If you want to give us like a first impression reading the stuff for the first time.
Yeah, so I knew the creator in terms of like just seeing their work all over like bookstores. The cover work has always been awesome, and then I would see like snippets online, right? I could not have imagined what would be inside. Very early on, I was like, oh man, am I out? But I read Megahex, which I think is the first collection.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I read that all the way through, and I was shocked I'd never like recognized Owl when it's like often referred to as like Megg, Mogg, and Owl, and I'm like, this character is new to me. And I was surprised. You just have an idea in your head and you're like, wow, this was not it. This is not what I imagined.
Fair enough. I think I kind of had a similar experience. I was aware of this stuff. I think, Tia, you probably mentioned it on the show, and I just never picked it up until late 2020, when Hanselmann was on his Instagram, was posting snippets of what became Crisis Zone, which came out in 2021. So he's kind of serializing Crisis Zone on social media, on Instagram. And Crisis Zone, that story is about them during the initial sort of COVID pandemic lockdown. So all these characters have to live together in the same house and deal with each other. And at one point it was shocking. The other point, it was weirdly comforting. Because like, okay, these characters are going through something, the same thing we're all going through. They're having a much worse time at it. And I can kind of like vicariously laugh at their troubles in a way. And it's a weird relief from the sort of tension that was that initial COVID lockdown. Ever since then, I've been buying the books as they've come out. I enjoyed that one. I really enjoyed Below Ambition. It's. I guess that's the question I kind of want to like pivot to and have this conversation about. It's like, and again, for those who are not familiar, I think Paloma kind of hinted at it. There's kind of maybe just a general content warning for all these comics. I'm not even sure how specific to put it. They are at points very graphic in terms of drug use and sex. They can be times scatological. They can be unpleasant at times, mainly because these characters, mainly Werewolf Jones, are some of the most unlikely people imaginable. And why do we enjoy reading these comics, or why do we read, whether we enjoy them or not, these comics about unlikable people doing terrible things? I don't know why I keep buying these books, but somehow I do.
Well, I mean, I think that the way that you described Crisis Zone is kind of the
Mhm.
way that I would describe all of these books. Like, we all know these people, or we've been these people. We've all
Mhm.
gone through a version of what they're going through, but they're going through it.
Yes.
And I think in a way, it kind of is just like validating to see it is universal enough that, you know, it's in a book and other people are buying the book and like we all relate to it. I think that there's something cathartic about taking it to kind of a ludicrous point that Simon Hanselmann does in his in the scenarios that he writes. A B, in his art style, which
Mhm.
is, I think you could describe it as like, it's a very stylized kind of, very simple, yeah, but at the same time, very expressive because he's very good at, I think, composing a scene. Like you're reading it and you're like, yes, like this is the cartoonist, but then like it's composed in a way where the the punchline or the emotion, or there's always like a really strong punch of story beat in what seems like a very straightforward kind of cartoon drawing. And so you also have, I think, a sort of nonchalance that the characters have about all of these crazy zany things that are going on with them.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the internal logic of their world where this stuff happens, like something about it kind of turns the temperature down on it in a way while simultaneously presenting it as ludicrous.
Yes, yeah, I think you covered a lot of ground there, and like that's the thing I really was struck by reading this stuff for the first time, is this idea that it seems shocking when you're reading it, but the characters have already done all this stuff. Like they're not really phased by Werewolf Jones. As there's very rare that he does something that shakes his friends. You know what I mean? Because I've seen it before. That's just the way he is, and that kind of makes it more unsettling in a way than it might just be to have characters doing that kind of stuff, these sort of depraved acts. But that, I think, makes it more than just that. It adds a layer that makes it more, it makes it funnier, and it makes it kind of like oddly easier to stomach, if I could put it that way. Just like
Yeah.
to see the way the characters act. Like, okay, that's shocking to me if someone did that in real life, but these characters have seen it before and I understand their relationship. So it's like, I think, you know, it's easy to kind of like point out how much of the books are about the terrible things that characters do. But Hanselman, I think you already kind of hinted at, Tia, is like he's developed these characters really deeply. By the time you get a couple books deep, you kind of know these characters, not just the kind of people they are, but you understand their motivations, whether they have any or not. You know what I mean? Like there are moments in some books where Meg deals with her mom, and that's, you know, if you've, and like their relationship is very strained, and like whether you have that kind of relationship with your parent, or, you know, you have friends who have strained parental relationships, you can recognize that in Hanselman's cartooning. And it's like very poignant scenes, like very emotionally complex scenes that he's able to illustrate in the midst of these larger stories that don't always have that nuance.
And I've talked about this before on the show because I've recommended these books before for like our annual reading list and things like that.
Yeah.
But like you'll have two panels back to back where it's like the exact same drawing, but Meg's little tiny dots in her pupils just like point in a different direction in one. And it's just such a like gut punch
Mhm.
emotional beat. And you're
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
I have felt that way too. Line drawing of a witch.
Yes. Yeah. I know, Paloma, were there moments in the book you read where you kind of recognized that, the cartooning or like the emotional aspects of the stories?
Yeah, in Megahex, Meg's mom, I think, goes through something. You both time out Meg's mom. I'm like, what happened? Because I feel like in
Mhm.
Megahex, I thought she had died off panel.
Mhm.
And so we see Meg in real time go through like major depression and very like little words used in the storytelling. And then that's like a continuation where like Mogg will be like, oh, hang on, guys. Like Meg won't want to go because she's depressed. So I was surprised by how real like depression was handled
Mhm.
and like characters addressing it in juxtaposition to like Werewolf Jones or just like how Meg and Mogg were treating Owl when they were like roommates. But
Mhm.
I will say I did like the cartooning, good paneling, good comedic beats with like no words.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's great there.
Yeah. I think that might be the greatest strength to the books. Again, like I think they're very entertaining, but like Hanselman's cartooning style and sense of storytelling, it's nice that it worked out for the perfect, like the frames he would draw, the panels he would draw would work perfectly on Instagram and on social media. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think like when he was doing Crisis Zone, you're following the comic almost like panel by panels. It was like getting like a daily comic strip in your Instagram feed. And then when the book came out, I sat down and read it all in one go as like one big story, and it kind of made more sense that way. So it's not like one or the other. I think it's very smart the way he's able to use marketing and social media to kind of advertise these stories in that cartooning style. Fits really well.
And honestly, like, I think it's good to, like, Paloma, you made a great choice to start with Megahex, but you could really just pick up any of the books and, like, you'll get the gist. And there are overarching storylines that are happening, but it's a really episodic read because, you know, there'll be like, a chapter or a story will be like maybe a couple of pages long, and they follow, you know, like Meg and Mogg break up at some point, and, you know, like Meg goes off and does other things, and Werewolf Jones has different story, like people have storylines, but you don't necessarily, it's not like so plot driven that you couldn't pick up the second or third book or Crisis Zone or whatever, and like you would be able to follow.
Yeah, and I think as the cast of characters gets kind of bigger, you have these other characters pop in and out. I Dracula Jr. is one of my favorite characters. Just
Yeah.
um yeah, and I think Owl's a fascinating character. Like how there's moments in, especially in Crisis Zone, because they're all in the house together. There's like so little, they can't like leave the house. They're all kind of stuck together, and like you see how Meg and Mogg's behavior like affects Owl. Like he at the beginning of like Crisis Zone, he's like, I just have to go get a job. Like I'll find a job I can work at. I'll make some extra money since no one else can work. You know what I mean? He's like trying to keep the house together so desperately. Meanwhile, it literally is the chaos zone or crisis zone. You know, it's like, so like there's just no one cares, no one trying to help them. They have an excuse to stay home and like do drugs all day. So it's fascinating to see how that character handles that. And I think again that speaks to the strength of Hanselman's sense of storytelling. Like he gives these characters these moments to kind of like be pushed to their limit, and Owl kind of breaks at that moment in that story, and it's satisfying when it happens. You know, you see him finally at the end of his rope.
I think in order for Meg and Mogg to make sense and be kind of a middle ground that is like skirting the line between ridiculous and relatable,
Mhm.
you need to present them as the center of opposites. And so you need Owl and you need
Mhm.
Werewolf Jones.
Yes, yes. Um, the two extremes there. Yeah, I think we've already hinted at Werewolf Jones. Yeah, if you're unfamiliar with these books, he is the he is chaos embodied. You know, it's just like any type of depraved hedonistic behavior he's engaged in to extremes that, you know, the other characters have not. It's shocking at times, which makes the fact that he's the character that is a parent so funny. Like, you know,
God.
Yes. And all the depravity, when he engages in it, he does it in my head anyway. Like when I'm reading his dialogue, his first of all, he played by Will Arnett. Second, just like so normal. Like in Werewolf Jones's mind, like everything he's doing is just normal. And I think that's like kind of part of the beauty of it, is that like the character's behavior, even when it is completely outlandish, to them is normal. And so there are, like, Owl has big reactions to things, but that's Owl's character. But the characters that when they do crazy things, it's not like, woo, look at me, I'm being so edgy. And that's, I think, why it isn't offensive in the way that other comic books that are like, you know, the same maybe type of content, but they just feel like really inauthentic and edgelordy and like not pleasant at all. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't know if I can say it's not gratuitous. That might not be the best word, but it's not done for shock's. Well, sometimes it does feel like it's a shock for shock's sake.
Well,
but
I
it's
think
rooted in the characters. I think
yeah,
that's what you're getting at.
the characters themselves are doing it in good faith in their internal logic.
Yes. Yeah. So I think the most recent book is the one that I was reading to talk about in this episode was the Werewolf Jones and Sons Deluxe Summer Fun Annual, which I believe is a collection of some like independent small press comics that was put together by Fantagraphics. And like, again, I think that of all of the behaviors I've seen Werewolf Jones and Meg and other characters get into in the cross of these books, this one is kind of like, I don't want to say it's the most shocking, but it's like there's times I'm just like, boy, this is really kind of like unsettling, because it involves Werewolf Jones and his sons, and you see him being the worst father imaginable, mainly due to neglect, you know. But like, again, it's like it's all rationalized in his mind. Like that's just how he operates. Like that's how his kids are going to grow up, and it's kind of like really heartbreaking at times, even though it's also very funny at times. It's a weird thing for me to kind of juggle with as I was reading it. I'm glad I had read the other Megg and Mogg stuff to kind of have that background. If I think I had jumped in with this book, that would be kind of tough to kind of parse out, you know.
I almost want to do like a part 2 where Paloma reads the like Below Ambition and just does like the first and the last and like lets us know if it's a jarring transition, because we've eased in with all the middle ones.
Yeah.
God. Yeah, I'd be curious.
And for context, Paloma, I just randomly picked up Below Ambition and I randomly opened it to a page where Werewolf Jones appears to be sodomizing Meg, who hasn't cleaned herself in that area.
Wow.
While she's eating what appears to maybe be a mozzarella stick. And their friend Mike is standing next to them. Screaming, "Horse Mania! Woo!"
That's next level. Okay,
Yeah.
that's next level.
I guess, spoiler alert, Meg and Mogg broke up by then.
Yeah.
And actually, Bad Gateway is a really interesting volume, I think, in the collection of these books, because that's after Meg and Mogg break up, and it really represents, I think, like a fracture for Meg. And she goes on and she's like dating other people and kind of trying to find herself. The book itself is a large format book. So if you like on your bookshelf, it even is like, it doesn't fit with the other ones. And it's yeah. So it's like as a physical object, in addition to the part of Meg's story that it tells, it's just kind of like the thing that's not like the other.
And I think I kind of want to follow up on that point very briefly, where like I love reading these books physically. Like again, I mentioned them, you know, Hanselmann's serializing them on social media, and I think I initially read Crisis Zone as a PDF, but when I bought Below Ambition, it's just a nice package. You know, it's kind of like this soft cover book. It's a nice size. It's got the flexi disc you can put on your turntable. You can hear what Horse Mania sounds like. And then the Werewolf Jones and Sons Deluxe Summer Fun Annual is like this hardcover book that's supposed to emulate deluxe, like annual comics in England were different, because in England, an annual was like a hardcover collection of stories that weren't serialized before. So it's like, it's kind of emulating that. So it's almost the books as physical objects, I just really enjoy as well. You know, just, they're really just well put together comics, you know, physical comics.
You got to talk about the flexi disc.
I mean, that's one of the main reasons I bought Blue Ambition right when it came out, because that was the one after Crisis Zone, I think. And I was like, I was on board fully with Megg and Mogg at that point. And the fact that the story is about Megg and Werewolf Jones having a band and going on a little tour. And like, again, like, I've been in bands, I've been around touring bands, I've been in that scene. So that one hit very close to home. There's things in that book that's like, yeah, you either had to be in a band or go to a lot of indie shows to know that joke or know what's going on in that scene. It's really great. It's in a lot of great details in that book that specific to that moment in time in that scene. And then the flexi disc, which, you know, a little, maybe for those who aren't familiar, it's like a little tiny record, but it's like a thin, flimsy thing you can put in like a magazine or something. So I put it on my turntable and I got the book and I spun it. And it's funny. You never hear the band in the comic, obviously, because it's a comic. There's no sound. But it's not what I expected them to sound like.
No, it was not at all what I was expecting. And I actually liked it.
Yeah, it's good. It's like this ambient keyboard music. It's lo-fi. There's some vocals to it, but I can't recall actually like paying attention to the lyrics or really understanding the vocals. It's just like, yeah, it's like a 3.5 minute vibe, and it's a good vibe. Yeah.
I think I described it as like a montage in an A24 film.
Which is the perfect explanation. Yes. Yeah. So, and which is very funny because when you read Below Ambition and you see the way they behave on stage, like that's not the sound you expected them to be making, you know?
Exactly. Meg found her keyboard in a dumpster or something, and they're always drunk that so much that like the speech bubbles like are written so that it's very obvious they're slurring their words and kind of just a mess. Yeah, and we've all been to that show.
We've all been to that show. Some of us have played in bands at that show. And then what again I love too, it's like even with all that going on, like there's still like this amazing complex character development over that, because like, you know, they want to do this band. They can't really handle the stress of being a touring band, even on such a small scale. So immediately turn to booze and drugs, and like it just becomes a mess. You know, I mean, at the same time, Mike is their biggest fan, and every time they show Mike in the audience, he's screaming "Horse Mania," and like it makes me really appreciate the minor characters like Mike, you know, in that book. So,
you know what though, I think I don't agree with the description of their turning to drugs and alcohol because that's actually their like regular, like that's
true.
It would be weird if they turned away from it.
But I mean, I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier, where just like the characters are acting in the way that they are comfortable in the world. So it's like Megg and Werewolf Jones are suddenly in a band. They have to have responsibility. They have to show up to the gig on time. They have to perform. They have to make sure they get paid. They are not prepared for any of that. You know what I mean? So they just don't do it. And it's not like you read some stories where someone has to step up or have some character growth or development. It's like, no, that's just the way they are. And that's it. And that's why I'm reading the book, you know? Yeah. It is very interesting to me, like to see how much I kind of relate to the characters, even though they're the furthest thing from my personality. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I think that depression is like, if you've experienced depression, you recognize it in all of its faces.
Yes. Yeah. There are always moments, even in the worst thing that you've seen Werewolf Jones do, there's a sadness to it at the same time. You know what I mean? It's hedonism, almost devoid of pleasure, if that makes any sense, where it's just like he's just going through the motions at times. I think I noticed that when I was reading the Werewolf Jones and Sons story, because he's like, he has to take his kids like trick-or-treating, but then he becomes a kid. It's like, oh, I love trick-or-treating. Of course, he's not getting candy. He's getting trick-or-treating. He's getting other more adult things in his bag. And he kind of just disappears. But what's also funny too is like in that story, while they're trick-or-treating, the houses they go to are not normal houses. The people that live in those houses are as depraved as the other characters. So it's almost like the world that they inhabit has become so no consequences, no regrets, just, it's amazing. There's almost no normal people, quote unquote, in these books. You know what I mean?
Right. I mean, Owl, I think, is meant to be the closest thing to that. But even Owl is pretty like an exaggerated version of that figure in your life.
Yeah, there's a moment in a trick-or-treating story where they're all going to Werewolf Jones's house for a party, and Owl makes a point, is like saying like, oh yeah, Werewolf Jones told me it's going to be a pretty wild party, like I'm definitely going to get laid tonight. Like that's his focus, that's why he's going to the party. So he's not he's not some sort of like monk, like perfect person. Like he likes to enjoy himself as well, but then of course they show up and Werewolf Jones has his kids with him, so it can't get as wild as they had planned. So
Paloma, I'm interested to hear more about one of your notes that you have in the show notes, that you are not the target audience for these books.
Yeah, I don't really get a lot of like taking a leap just because Meg and Mogg's eyes are always pink. I'm not an super active participant in stoner culture, so I feel like their vibe sometimes goes over my head. And then also, just keep in mind these are like Megahex 2009, I think 2014. Some of it was like just so gross, physical humor. Like I like crass stuff, but I was like, holy crap. And I think you can tell so early on that like Owl is the stick in the mud. And I was like, Meg and Mogg are so mean to their roommate.
They're so mean to Owl.
I was like, this is too mean. But I feel like part of the reality is that like sometimes people are just your roommates and they're very immature. Like Owl's the only one with a job, I guess, in all the iterations, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it was just a little mean-spirited at first, which don't often gravitate towards those. But yeah, very gross, very early on. It might have been Werewolf Jones's birthday, and he takes a cheese grater to his person, and I was like, ew. And it's not even like nothing's drawn up close. It's just, I was like, holy crap, he's in an ambulance now. There's blood.
I'm glad that you described your not being the target audience for it this way, because I relate to everything that you just said. Like, I'm also not part of that subculture at all. I hate gross out humor. I hate toilet humor. I hate like really gratuitous content normally. And so I think part of my endless fascination and like enjoyment of these books is just like, why do I like these books so much? Because same.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's my reaction too. I think we're all kind of on the same boat. Like, this is a world so far from where I'm comfortable. It's almost like peeking into it. But again, like, I think I don't like the Jackass stuff. Even when it was, I was a teenager and it was happening like late when I was a teenager, early 20s, like I did not like that. It just, again, it felt like weirdly mean-spirited at times. And
yeah, it is.
And like, so is this book. But again, I feel like, I think we've kind of hinted at it a few times already. Like, I do think there is, the more you read of it, an emotional connection to the characters at a point. And like, I understand these characters in a way I'll never understand Steve-O. You know what I mean? I'm sure if Steve-O seems like a nice guy.
Jesus now.
Who's that? What?
Steve-O, if I'm maligning you, I apologize. But I thought I had heard that he like found religion or something.
Interesting.
I know he's like sober now, but that's all I know.
Well, that's good.
It's probably for the best. But again, it's like, and I'm sure, again, I've seen interviews with Steve-O and he's a very bright guy and I enjoy hearing him talk, but just like but he's like a real person, you know what I mean? And like somehow in these comics, like these characters are at one point so cartoonish and like caricatures. At the other point, when you do have the moment where, Owl gets frustrated, or Meg talks about her mom, or like even Werewolf Jones at times has these like very fleeting glimpses of like what am I doing? Like, where are my kids? It's just like that kind of stuff. I mean, again, they're very fleeting, but they're still there. And like, I think there's a complexity and nuance to the characters that you kind of don't get in most just normal, quote unquote, like gross out humor.
Another thing I think that kind of turns down the temperature on it a little bit is the fact that like Meg is a witch, Mogg is a cat, there's Owl.
Yes.
Like it's like the BoJack Horseman thing, right? Where they are like Mogg is a cat. He's also dating Meg, but he's also a cat. And they do have relations like a couple would. But he's still also a cat. But it's not bestiality because there's just an internal logic to the world where you're like, okay, that's happening. Like that's that. That's Werewolf Jones is a werewolf, and he also like is a bipedal character in this world who does all of these things. And so I think that as an artistic choice, that is a really smart way to kind of like get away with some of this stuff and have it authentic to the characters and to the internal universe, but not have it like quite cross the line into mean spirited because the verisimilitude's taken away.
Yes. And I think, I kind of hinted that earlier when I was talking about the trick-or-treating story. Like the town that they're in, the people they encounter are just as bad as they are. And it's like, if this story took place in the quote unquote real world or a more realistic setting, it would be more upsetting. You know what I mean? It would be kind of like uneasy. But the fact that it's presented as being, it's not glorifying it, but also not judging it. I think that's the fine line that Hanselmann walks, It's like this fascination with depravity, but also being very quick to like not be judgmental or yuck their yum, even though it's pretty yucky at times, So it's this fascinating way that I think Hanselmann's both his artwork and the way he tells the story are able to give you that distance and nuance and complexity in what seems to be a very simple art style and a simple story.
I was thinking about that because when we were your prompt of like we enjoy like seeing unlikable people do horrible terrible things, I was trying to think of like what's the thing that's hot, and so people are like the boys, and I'm assuming the superheroes are like all messed up, they don't care, but that's like a trope like that's just like riddled with like morality questions, and that's why it feels so depraved. Whereas like Meg, Mogg, Owl, Werewolf Jones, they're very much not human, but they're like normal people that we all know in their most, I guess, depraved, not caring state. And so I feel like that's why it works so well. Like you're saying, there's no judgment. They're just like, these are just people. They're not part of like some moral trope. What they do is like isn't outlandish because it's not necessarily like, oh, a witch would never do something like this. It's like
right.
Right.
And also their world is very small. If you are a superhero like the characters in The Boys, like your platform and your reach and your expectations go far beyond you. But these characters, like they're kind of burnout nobodies. And so their behavior doesn't necessarily affect too many people outside of themselves. And their immediate circle.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is like their world is so small and like it doesn't really affect the outside world. It's like like I said, you're kind of like peeking into someone's psyche in a way when you read these books, the psyche of the characters, and like it makes it somewhat easier to kind of stomach what's happening in the comics.
And they really don't have much like that they're trying to do beyond just sort of get by themselves. I think that, when Meg breaks up with Mogg and kind of goes out into the world and like below ambition, like that's the most that they've ever really tried to do anything forward looking, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, like being out of their comfort zone, but they don't know how to like navigate it without their vices. You know what I mean? And it creates humor. I mean, that's the dramatic tension of Below Ambition, which I think I really enjoyed that story so much because of that. We're just like, you're seeing them, you're kind of rooting for them. I think that's what makes it work too. You're rooting for them, like, oh, they're doing something creative, like they're writing songs, they're in a band, they go out there and play for an audience. It's like, that's good for them. Like they're not just sitting at home, but yet they don't change at all, you know? So it's like, that's what makes it an interesting story to me.
The very first pages of it really broke my heart because like you are really rooting for at least Meg, I think. And then she like schleps her keyboard on the bus all the way across town to Werewolf Jones's house, and they're supposed to rehearse. And like rehearsal is by its nature work, right? Like it's
Yeah.
not the glory part. And she's there and she showed up and she wants to do the work. And Werewolf Jones is busy doing this, that, and the other depraved thing. And they never actually get around to rehearsing. And she's, you know, in Simon Hanselmann's beautiful way of depicting these emotions, like she's so deflated and she, you know, she goes back home and you feel so deflated for her because it's, yeah, you're like, she's finally found something that is giving her just the tiniest spark to like go outside of herself and try to do something more. And she has no support. She has no friends who will go with her to do that.
Right.
And it's just, it's so heartbreaking, even as other ludicrous things happen in the book.
So I will say that the last short story in Blue Ambition, the last like maybe like 5 or 6 pages, pick up on that. And I don't want to spoil anything in case anyone does read it, because I think it actually is a very like poignant, emotional way to end that story. And it's again one of the rare instances where you kind of feel really bad and like heartbroken by the way, you know, Meg is treated at times, or like what happened to her. But at the same time, it's like this bittersweet ending. I don't want to spoil it, but it's such a great way to end that book. With her looking back at that moment in her life, like kind of a flash forward kind of moment at the end of the book where you kind of like understand what she's going through. And most of it is silent. Most of it is like all just like silent cartooning. I mean, again, silent, all comics are silent. Like there's no dialogue, just her by herself for a few moments trying to recapture a memory or something. It's a really beautiful way to end that story. And I think that's, if I was going to recommend, I think that's maybe like a good way to kind of summarize this conversation. If we could think about a good way to start. I know, Tia, you mentioned you can jump in at any point. I think Below Ambition is kind of a nice way to start this series. If you want to just jump in, it's not a very long book. It's not as long as the other ones. You can kind of jump in. I think it has a, like I said, a very poignant ending and beginning. And again, if you have any experience in the indie music scene, you'll recognize a lot of the moments in that book. That would be my recommendation to start with.
And in the back of the book, Simon Hanselmann talks about his own experience in indie bands, and like actually that the flexi disc is a recording that he and his friends did in their band, and just kind of talking about I would really recommend also, if people are interested, to look up interviews and places where Simon Hanselmann talks more about these characters. He's a really interesting person.
Yes.
And I think like really, really smart about how he kind of digests and synthesizes and communicates about his own experiences growing up in this sort of like middle of nowhere. And anyone who's lived in the middle of nowhere as a thinking person who kind of like has an inkling or an instinct that there's more out there, but literally just doesn't know what they don't know because of how isolated they are where they live. You know, like it's just such a particular kind of frustration that is really, I think, at the core of all of these books and characters.
Yeah. Paloma, are you going to give it another shot? Would you dive back in for another helping of Megahex, do you think? Or was that enough?
I will say, before talking to both of you, I was like, all right, that was enough. That was enough for me. But I think hearing other people talk about elements that they really like from the other books, and I had heard like around 2021, maybe in 2020, when Simon Hanselmann was posting what became Crisis Zone online, like I heard people who hadn't read really much of like Megahex stuff being like, oh, this is like so good. So I am curious now. First book, without speaking to any fans, I was like, nope. But now I genuinely am intrigued.
Paloma, I'm not sure we've ever actually been on a show together. What is your normal like reading list look like?
Oh, my normal reading list. I do like superhero stuff, like Nightwing. I really enjoy. He's a fun guy. Indie stuff. Right now, or I guess Image stuff is Falling in Love, On the Path to Hell. So that has some violence, but has an undercurrent of romance eventually. So I do like that. And I do like slice of life where people are maybe a little bit more, not, I guess Meg and Mogg people are genuine, but I guess maybe on the more positive side of life.
Right. More of a Giant Days person than a Megahex person.
Well, yes.
Gotcha. Understand.
Well, I think that's nice to hear. Again, like these are books that I really like, and I'm always kind of hesitant to recommend them due to some of the content. I don't want to like, shock anybody too badly or like traumatize somebody if they're not ready for it. Again, try to like give people a heads up what to expect, but like, it's nice to know that even if your initial reaction is being caught up in like the content, I think these are books, at least from my experience, and it sounds like from Tia's experience, that the more time you spend with them, there is a reward to reading them. It's not just like we were saying earlier, gratuitous or, shock for shock's value. Like there is emotional core to these books that I think keeps me coming back to them. And that's the thing, like, hopefully this conversation, if anyone is curious to dive in, like, there is something there for you to latch onto emotionally with these books. Believe it or not.
No, I totally agree with that. And I mean, and they are funny. They're so funny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would recommend, if anyone is curious and has not read this stuff, check out Simon Hanselmann's social media on Instagram. Of course, I'm blanking on the but it's easy to find. We can probably put it in the show notes or something, and you can kind of see him posting snippets of the books to get a little taste of it. And then if you want more, there's plenty to check out. Like, again, there's plenty of books out there. And I think Crisis Zone for sure is a good one to check out. And I said Below Ambition might be kind of my favorite for a number of reasons, as I enumerated earlier. But they're great comics. And Tia, thank you for giving us an excuse to talk about them today.
I'm very happy to. It's my like biannual pop up on the podcast and then disappear for another 6 months. So glad it could be a meaningful one.
It's always a pleasure. Any final thoughts before we put this one to bed, so to speak? I'll say it. I'll say, in the words of Mike, Horse Mania.
Not our Mike, although maybe our Mike. I don't know.
But yeah.
I haven't asked him.
I know Mike is also a fan of these books, so hopefully he enjoyed hearing us talk about them, and maybe we could do a follow-up down the road. Paloma can give us an update if you go further, and then we can talk about anything that's come out since then. So thank you both for helping me out today. That was a very fun conversation. I want to thank everyone for listening. Thank you, Zander, for editing it, and thank you, Mike, for letting me fill in. Until next time, comics are good, and so are you.